In the small northern Alabama town where Tyler and Jamie grew up, the long summer days seemed to stretch on forever, and the heat shimmered above the sun-cracked sidewalks. The town itself was a patchwork of picket fences, tall oak trees, and neighbors who knew one another's names, and most of their business. Old houses with wraparound porches gave the place a timeless feel, as if the modern world were just a rumor passing through. It was the perfect setting for two best friends to chase adventure on their bicycles. Tyler and Jamie had known each other since before they could remember. In elementary school, they stuck together like glue, always swapping lunches or whispering secrets in class. After school, they'd rush home just long enough to dump their backpacks and grab their bikes. It didn't matter if it was a humid July afternoon or a crisp fall evening. If they could ride, they would. The sidewalks, back alleys, and overgrown lots were their personal playgrounds. For them, the miles of asphalt and dusty trails were enough to spark endless games of make-believe, mock battles, and wild explorations. Jamie had the spirit of a daredevil. If there was a dirt jump, he'd fly over it without hesitation. If there was a creepy abandoned shed, he'd push the door open and go in first, heart pounding with excitement. Tyler, on the other hand, had a cautious soul. He found himself double-checking each new place before stepping inside. He didn't like surprises, at least not the spooky kind. Somehow, though, Jamie's boldness and Tyler's caution fit perfectly together, forming a bond as strong as family. One would lead the way and the other would keep an eye out for trouble. The edge of their neighborhood merged with a dense stretch of forest, its canopy rising like a fortress of green. Dirt paths led in and out of the woods, secret routes the boys memorized through countless rides. They built rickety forts with fallen branches, tried to spot deer through the brush, and once even discovered a small creek, which they declared their hidden swimming hole for the summer. Still, one path stood out among all the others, a narrow, winding road known locally as Shadow Lane. Shadow Lane was different from every other trail. The trees on either side stretched tall and close, their branches tangling overhead to form a tunnel of leaves. The sunlight that did filter in arrived in patches, leaving the rest of the path in a cold, greenish gloom. A hush fell whenever anyone ventured there, as if the forest itself resented the intrusion. The air felt somehow older and heavier, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Tyler got goosebumps just thinking about it. As for Jamie, he treated Shadow Lane like a personal challenge. He'd pedal into that tunnel of leaves, whooping and laughing, daring Tyler to keep up. Tyler often did, though his heart pounded louder than the cicadas in the trees. He'd glance around at the shifting shadows, half convinced he could see figures flitting through the foliage. But he pressed forward, trusting Jamie's confidence enough to drown out his own worries. By middle school, the two friends had fully claimed the woods as their domain. They'd stashed bags of snacks and bottled water in hollowed-out logs for their longer expeditions, returning home only at dusk or when their stomachs rumbled for dinner. Their parents, though fond of cautionary lectures, mostly let them roam. Small-town life still had its freedoms. The only real warnings they ever received were about snakes or poison ivy. Rarely did anyone mention the deeper mysteries that might lurk among those ancient trees. As time passed, Shadow Lane became their proving ground. They'd race each other along the winding road, the dim, cool air wrapping around them. Tyler always felt a prickle of unease, but he forced it down. He couldn't let Jamie label him a chicken. When Jamie teased him, Tyler pushed harder. On good days, he could keep pace. On braver days, he might even pull ahead, if only for a moment, while Jamie's laughter echoed through the canopy. One late September evening, with the sky turning a fiery mix of orange and purple, Jamie and Tyler planned a final race for the day. The air was crisp, stirring the fallen leaves across the ground. The tall trees along Shadow Lane rustled in an autumn breeze, their branches shedding gold and red foliage. Both boys were invigorated by the weather. They pedaled fast, bantering back and forth about who'd reach the streetlight at the far end of the lane first. Tyler felt oddly light and strong that evening. Usually his nerves made him lag behind, but something about the mild temperature and the smell of fall leaves sparked a burst of energy in him. As they veered onto Shadow Lane, he realized he was ahead, a rare triumph. He could feel Jamie's presence close behind, each pedal stroke a challenge. The dim corridor of leaves stretched before them, and Tyler focused on the streetlight's faint glow up ahead, pedaling like he'd never pedaled before. Then he broke free from the gloom. The warm lamplight bathed him in soft orange as he screeched to a stop, breathing hard. He turned around, expecting to see Jamie glide out of the trees a few seconds later, flushed and laughing, ready to blame some imaginary obstacle for his loss. But the lane remained silent. No bike wheels on gravel, no familiar laugh. Tyler waited, the seconds stretching uncomfortably. His heart sank. Darkness was setting in, and there was no sign of Jamie. After several minutes, fear took hold. He called Jamie's name, his voice echoing off the towering oaks and pines. Only silence answered. Unable to face the growing night alone, Tyler tore home, tears burning his eyes. He burst into the living room breathless, trying to explain that Jamie never made it out of Shadow Lane. The entire town responded with an urgency Tyler had never witnessed. Volunteers and neighbors arrived on the scene with flashlights and search dogs. The local sheriff, a tired-eyed man who seemed to know every resident by name, directed small search parties through different sections of the woods. Tyler and his parents watched anxiously from the roadside, the beam of flashlights bobbing among the dark trees. For hours, the searchers combed every path. They finally found Jamie's bike near a dense patch of brambles, twisted at an odd angle. His jacket lay nearby, snagged on some thorny branches. Yet of Jamie himself, there was no trace. It was as though the forest had swallowed him. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The frantic searches turned up no further leads. Missing person flyers appeared in the post office and grocery store windows, but answers never came. News trucks arrived briefly, capturing footage of the quiet woods and the worn faces of worried townspeople, then left when the story went cold. The heartbreak lingered in every household, especially in Tyler's. He replayed that September evening in his mind countless times, tormenting himself with what-ifs. What if he had turned back sooner? What if he'd never agreed to that race in the first place? Years slipped by. Tyler entered high school without his best friend. He felt adrift, his once vibrant love of adventure replaced by guilt. In conversations, He avoided the subject of Jamie unless directly asked. The mention of Shadow Lane was enough to make him tense up and shudder. His parents were gentle, assuring him it wasn't his fault, but deep down he still felt responsible. On moonlit nights, he'd sometimes stare out his window, half expecting to see Jamie standing at the edge of the yard, beckoning him to come out and ride. When Tyler reached adulthood, he couldn't leave that haunting memory behind quickly enough. He moved out of town, heading for a modest apartment in a nearby city with busier streets and tall office buildings. The city's hum drowned out the echo of cicadas and the whisper of branches. He found a job, met new friends, and built a life that demanded his attention, leaving little room for the nightmares of that fateful evening. Eventually, he married and had 2 children, a boy and a girl. In time, the gentle swirl of everyday responsibilities formed a cocoon around him, protecting him from the old ghosts. Yet each visit back to see his parents tore at that cocoon. The roads would become quieter, the air thick with humidity. And then came the inevitable approach, the stretch of pavement that curved alongside Shadow Lane. Though he rarely drove all the way down it, Tyler couldn't resist a glance. The trees had grown even denser, their limbs arching overhead like a sentinel warning him away. Guilt, sadness, and that primal fear always resurfaced, though dulled by years of distance. When Tyler's daughter turned 11, she grew fascinated with the stories her father told of riding bikes and exploring forests as a kid. Never one to shy away from adventure, she pestered him to show her the places he had frequented in his youth. Tyler skirted the subject for a while, focusing on safer memories, playing tag in the neighbor's yard, fishing at the local creek. But one evening, driving home from a family gathering, his daughter spotted the entrance to Shadow Lane. With the curiosity and determination of Jamie himself, she begged him to take her there, her eyes sparkling at the hint of mystery in the dark corridor. It was the last thing Tyler wanted to do, but he also didn't want to disappoint his child. Against his better judgment, he turned onto Shadow Lane. The road looked just as he remembered, dim, chilly, the canopy overhead so thick that only dappled moonlight broke through. His son, younger and more timid, was content to stay in the car, but his daughter insisted on stepping out for a moment. Tyler's heart thudded as he parked under the same streetlight, the one that had signaled victory that long ago evening. They walked a short distance into the woods. Tyler clutched a flashlight, his grip so tight his knuckles whitened. The forest floor crackled under their feet, the leaves rustling with the faint breeze. Every step felt like a walk back through time, and he half expected to see the battered remains of Jamie's bike. His daughter soaked in the surroundings with wide-eyed wonder, oblivious to the tangle of emotions gripping her father. Something darted through the undergrowth, a deer or perhaps a raccoon, and Tyler nearly jumped out of his skin. The flashlight wobbled in his hands, illuminating tangled branches and patches of darkness. His daughter giggled, and the tension in Tyler's chest loosened just a fraction. She reminded him so much of Jamie, bold, curious, certain that no harm would come her way. They didn't venture far, just enough to catch the damp scent of moss and the deeper hush of the thickening woods. When they turned back, the streetlight's glow in the distance felt like a beacon of safety. Tyler realized his heart wasn't pounding as violently anymore. The dread was still there, but it was tempered by something else. Hope, perhaps, or the acceptance that while some mysteries remain unsolved, life can continue. Over the next few years, Tyler found himself driving by Shadow Lane more often, occasionally stopping to gaze down the road. The sorrow and guilt he'd carried for so long began to ease, shifting into something quieter. It wasn't that he forgot Jamie or what happened. Rather, he felt the stirrings of an understanding that the unknown wasn't always the enemy. The forest that had taken Jamie also brimmed with life, starlit clearings, hidden fawns, and secret springs. Eventually, his daughter grew old enough to have her own adventures, though she preferred rock climbing and canoeing to bike rides through haunted woods. Still, she brought friends to see the legendary Shadow Lane, weaving a spooky campfire story about the kid who vanished decades ago. She always ended with a note of respect for the courage it took to ride down that road, and for the father who overcame his fear to share it with her. Meanwhile, Tyler's visits to his hometown became less about dreading the old memories and more about understanding them. He'd chat with old neighbors at the grocery store, occasionally hearing how they still had no leads on Jamie's case. Sometimes people claimed to see odd shapes flitting among the trees, a trick of the moonlight or a wandering spirit. Others said Shadow Lane was just an ordinary road, dark and narrow, but nothing more. No matter which version Tyler believed, he accepted that the truth remained elusive. On one of his visits, Tyler found the courage to leave his car at the start of Shadow Lane and walk the entire length on foot. His parents had passed away by then, and he felt a pull to confront the ghosts of his youth alone. Clutching a walking stick, he made his way under the arching branches, letting the hush of the forest envelop him. Everything smelled of earth and wet leaves, just as it had on that autumn evening so many years ago. He paused halfway, near a twisted patch of bushes that might have been where they'd once found Jamie's bike. Wind whispered through the canopy, and Tyler closed his eyes, remembering Jamie's grin, his wild laughter. A deep ache settled in his chest, grief, love, and regret all bound together. He muttered a quiet thanks to his friend, hoping in some mysterious way Jamie could hear it. Finishing his trek, he emerged at the other side of the lane where the streetlight stood. A newer, more modern pole now, but in the same position as the old one. He breathed a sigh of relief, simultaneously feeling worn and uplifted. The fear that had haunted him since childhood seemed smaller in the face of his perseverance. Somewhere inside, he felt Jamie smiling. As time wore on, Tyler's hair grayed, his children grew up, and the story of Shadow Lane passed through another generation. What once had been a source of nightmares gradually became a lesson in bravery and acceptance. The forest that swallowed Jamie didn't lose its mystery, but Tyler's heart no longer twisted in guilt whenever he neared it. Instead, he found a measure of peace in the memory of boyhood adventures, the fierce innocence of exploring a world where anything seemed possible. On the rare nights Tyler still dreamed of that dim corridor of trees, Jamie stood at the far end, bathed in moonlight, his bike balanced against one hip. He would wave Tyler forward, beckoning him to ride. In those dreams, Tyler wasn't paralyzed by fear. He'd leap onto his bike and pedal hard, chasing after the ghost of a beloved friend in a place that glowed with the magic of memory and youth.